He is, apart from his name, a figment of my imagination, while Zdenya is his female counterpart. So I return to my question. Why keep faithful to goodness? The answer I have reached, but would prefer not to accept, is this. Peter Ledeck chooses to be good. He confronts injustice. He gives alms to the poor. He places himself in danger to rescue cats out of trees. He fights for freedom using words and peaceful action. He is always kind to women and makes love to them tenderly. He lives without the extravagant comforts of our time and offers his bed to travelers just as he takes the floor. He is a man without selfishness or vanity. But why does Peter do these things? There are two answers, neither of which is adequate. One is stupidity, the other is hope. I suggest stupidity because only a dullard will not see the faults of this world and continue to rescue cats from trees or give alms to the poor. But is that all stupidity would achieve? The recognition of injustice, to identify oppression and fight for freedom. These are not the products of stupidity. Rather, they are the culmination of hours of analysis, debate, and moral struggle. These are not the activities of a stupid man. And so this first answer is indeed inadequate. Does Peter Ledeck have hope? Yes. He has hope in the Garden of Eden, in the fantasy of a future without sin, one where history no longer repeats itself. And in this way, Peter is the real Marxist. No one will starve. No one will oppress another. And all men will walk as brothers. And yet now he finds himself hunted by the party who claims ownership of such ideals. That is because if all men walked as brothers, then no man would hold power over the other, and no state, communist, fascist, or republic, will ever condone such a utopia. Peter so believes in this fantasy that it pours from him. It directs his actions, and it refuses inaction. It torments him, but brings him to his own salvation. His faith in goodness lies in his hope for the future. This is why I despise Peter Ledeck. I do not believe in his vision of the future. I have no such garden sowed within my mind. The end of history was written in its beginning, and our choices will continue to keep paradise at bay. Here we all unwillingly live in the darkness of the garden of men. If it is such dreams of paradise that hold people to goodness, such comfortable delusions that drive one to do good, then Peter, Zdenya, and all the names are no better than me or the party. They invoke goodness because it will lead them to a fulfilled fantasy and appease their insecurity. And yet they condemn me, just as the Soviets condemned them. Perhaps that is my point. What drives me to madness is the hypocrisy of Peter and Stenya. Come down from your delusional clouds and live in the garden of men, where we toil and struggle and understand that this is the way it has been and shall always be. When I finished the list, I gave the field warrants to Jetka, who took them with her usual lack of warmth. It was a Friday, and so I decided to call Anetska, see if she would have dinner with me that night. To my great pleasure, she accepted, and we dined at the lounge. I did not feel that she required an explanation for our last encounter, and as expected, she made no reference to it. We ate dinner and spoke of the rain and other trivialities. For the greater part of the evening, we sat in silence. It was not unusual, nor did I find it uncomfortable. Occasionally, as she looked down at her plate, I let my eyes linger on her. She wore a red dress that cradled her bosom and draped over her petite figure with a sophisticated elegance. As we approached her room for the evening's culmination, I felt extraordinarily at ease, and I would have laughed, but laughter still evaded me. As we entered her room and Anetska began undressing, it turned into a strange discomfort, as though I were invoking the memory of something that best lay buried. I put it out of my mind, lay down on the bed beside her, and began to softly caress her neck and breasts. The smell of her hair and the taste of her skin carried the memory of the many times I had held her. But there was something else. I knew what it was, but dared not acknowledge it. So I continued kissing her body. But beneath the surface I could feel the determined indifference of her mind. She had trained her body to do what her mind was unwilling to do. And here I was, like some beast in the wilderness, claiming ownership over something that was not mine in the least. Still I persisted, my hands roaming over her in a primal grope of lust. But the more lustful my hands became, the less my mind was willing, and I realized I was as limp as a dumpling. I renewed my attempt, but the more I tried with Anetska, the more frustrated I became. I never had such a problem and felt ashamed I should expose my manhood so carelessly. Again I tried, but all I could think of was Anetska's mind, somewhere hidden in the body under me, waiting to come out with all that was done. As I thought of it, I became convinced that Peter Ledek and Stenya were in the room with me, and a sharp mocking laughter grew in my ear. I sat up and saw Peter and Stenya standing hand in hand in the center of the room, laughing at me. "I thought I put you away," I whispered. They did not answer. They only laughed. It was the same sound that had come from the butcher and his wife. The same pitiful disdain at my attempts to be a man. Anetska brought me back. She asked what was wrong in a sweet voice, and though I did not know if she was sincere, she was not laughing. I pondered the question for a moment, but having not been asked such a question in some time, I did not know how to answer. And at this the laughter grew. 100 people now stood in the room, laughing, some rolling on the floor in hysterics, some quietly chuckling in contentment, some bellowing and heaving. I could name each one. I knew their dates of birth, their children's names, their occupations, their illegal activities. For each name had been etched into my brain through that horrible list was a face that mocked me. Faces that could triumph because righteousness was theirs and not mine. I looked down at Anetska. Her eyes were full of tenderness and a curiosity into my condition that comforted me. And because I had forgotten how to laugh, how to make love, how to answer a simple question, I fell into Anetska's arms and cried, and the crowd disappeared. When I arrived at long last, Maminka was angrier than I had anticipated. Even as I knocked, I heard her muffled voice on the other side of the door call out, "This better not be my stupid son!" I said nothing and soon heard her pull the latch of the door. "Maminko," I said when the door was open, half in greeting, half in supplication. She waddled back to her small living room and resumed her position in front of the television. I closed the door behind me and made my way after her. I had bought a small bouquet of flowers as a peace offering, but she simply slapped them down beside her on the small sofa, keeping her eyes locked on the television screen and her arms crossed over her bosom. I rolled my eyes and looked into the kitchen. Food sat along the small kitchen counter. Her fine blue china was set out in a stately row. She had risen early, gone to the market, hurried home, and prepared my favorite meal, only to wait for hours. My heart ached at the hope and anticipation she had poured into every dumpling and every crushed garlic clove. In the face of her excitement, my lax tardiness made her efforts seem foolish to her. A blue china plate piled with dumplings, now cold, sat on the counter. She had garnished the plate with parsley, and this too she thought I would take note of, and commend her for the bourgeoisie appearance she had given the meal. At this we would laugh, and then we would eat the food and she had prepared, and share a bottle of beer. For a time, she could reclaim the past. Those dumplings with parsley garnish made my entire being mourn for my mother's failed afternoon dinner. I knelt down before her and took her hand in mine. I told her that I was sorry that lately I had much on my mind, and so had spent the day walking and thinking. She looked at me, and her stern grimace melted. She patted my cheek and said she forgave me. Her eyes were so full of tenderness that I had to look away for fear that tears would form in my own. Maminka leaned over the countertop, warming the dumplings, pork roast, and sauerkraut. I watched her as she puttered between the counter and table, where she had insisted I sit and rest. She had become remarkably frail over the past few years, not in weight or agility, but in her shuffle and stature, the way she held her head and forged her smile. Her endless blue eyes still twinkled, though with a sobriety that had not been there before. as if her gaze were lost in a place no one else could see. As I watched her, her present frailty clashed with the memory of her determined stride. The way that she had marched into my school demanding to know why my teacher had beaten me, or the steadiness of her hands and voice when she told me my father had died, or the laughter that rang from her as she chased me through the buttercup-laden meadows of our old home. The memory stood apart from the white hair and wrinkled skin that now seemed almost translucent, as though she were disappearing. At last Maminka sat down at the table and I gratefully ended my drift into memory. She placed a steaming pile of Viprokindro Zello before me as I poured the cold beer into our glasses. For every Czech knows that there is no superior combination than sauerkraut, dumplings, pork roast, and beer.
You know, this would all taste much better if it had been eaten fresh. Now the roast is too dry,
she said once we had begun eating. I assured her the roast was not dry.
and the dumplings, they too seemed dry, or perhaps not soft enough.
I told her the dumplings were moist and fluffy, as she well knew they were. But it seems that in old age one searches for praise much like one did as a child. It amused me to think of the reversal of roles, of how I now sat as a parent might before a child, humoring her leading questions and commentary.
So what do you spend your days doing that makes you forget your mother for hours? I've always said you think too much,
she said, holding the fork as though she were underlining her assertion. But now I did not know what to say. I could not tell her about the warrants or Netska, or anything that pressed upon my mind, and so work was all I said, and she knew not to question me further. She was aware that I no longer worked for the housing ministry, and had been moved to the ironically named Justice Ministry. She had been informed of this by the nosy Mrs. Blasakove, who kept abreast of all the ongoings of everyone who had come from our small village. We momentarily sat in silence that spoke of the question she wanted to ask, but whose answer she did not want to hear. So instead, she talked about the neighbors and their imbecile son and the dirty sidewalks in this part of Prague. After dinner, we sat on the sofa in front of her small television, sipping my uncle's Medovina. As we sipped, the liqueur loosened her tongue, and Maminka spoke of our old home, something she rarely did unless induced by drink. I sat beside her, wishing her to be silent, lest she let loose the unbearable heaviness that comes when nostalgia is evoked. Nostalgia. It is a worm that burrows into your brain and recalls stale joys made untouchable by time. But she did set that loose, and she spoke in interminable sighs of the smell of the wood stove as it was stoked by my father on a deep winter night. She spoke of me, silly things I did when I could barely walk or speak. She spoke of the signs of life that spring brought each year, the dandelions, buttercups, and phlox that flooded the hills and meadows she roamed in childhood. As brooks swelled and rushed down into the valleys, removing ribbons of white water, her eyes were focused on the dark television screen, whose only image was the pale reflection of her and me sitting on a musty couch with sherry glasses in our hands. It was a sad image, made sadder still because Maminka had all but disappeared, lost to the abyss of perfect memory. With each word I felt my heart grow heavier, my legs restless and my hands anxious. Beauty is trampled on in age, and to be reminded of such atrocity can hardly be borne. As my mother fell further and further into this perfect past that may or may not have ever existed, she turned to me and her eyes were wet with tears. I looked at her, and all I could see was the echo of a joy long dissipated. She alone was sustained by this memory of a time forgotten by all except her.
You remember how happy we were?
She asked. I thought and remembered. Something, perhaps. If it was happiness, I did not want to know. I did not want to remember. But I looked into her eyes and saw the desperation that age must breed. That yearning to know that life has been happy, hopes fulfilled, dreams lived, life has been worth living. And so I looked at her wrinkled face, her lips quivering, uncertain whether to smile or scream. And I gave her the contemptuous confirmation she desired. That happy memories were all that filtered into my brain. That the lamentable present was made bearable by the perfect past. She released a sigh of relief and fell back into her chair. Her muscles relaxed and her mind drifted into the hourglass. My head fell and my eyes dipped into the golden color of the med in my glass. I could not help but feel that I was partially to blame, that in some way I had caused her brevity of joy, and so I lifted my glass and swallowed the sorrow of a perfect past with the sweet liqueur. A voice echoed in the darkness. You don't have to hide. I know you're there. I said nothing. I'm the rector here. He paused. Not a policeman. It seemed I had little choice but to take the voice at its word. He was alone, and that afforded me the security to venture out from the shadows and into the dim candlelight. I looked at the man. He was older than me, with gray encroaching on what sporadic brown hair remained on his head. He had a round face, with circular glasses that jutted out and rested on the tip of his nose. On his neck he wore the collar of a priest. I apologized for my intrusion and moved toward the door. You need not be afraid. I told him I was not afraid. He smiled and moved to sit down in a pew. Everyone is afraid. The city is afraid. Anxiety grips the nation and the world trembles. He released a sigh with his last word, as if he felt the fear and yet found it amusing. I said nothing, and only thought of leaving. Were you afraid I was a policeman? or a priest? I said nothing for some time and thought the question curious. But then I did speak. Is there a difference? He laughed, though he looked surprised. Yes. In this world there is a difference. You are a policeman of God. You condemn just as the party condemns. You both choose your salvations. You both decide what is right and wrong. The priest looked at me, eyebrows lifted in surprise. He rose to his feet, but it was not out of irritation or anger. I stepped back as he approached. God does not condemn. It is we who condemn ourselves. Believe in the party and they will not condemn. But does the party give us salvation? Eternal salvation? It claims to, just as you claim it. And what of truth? I paused for a moment, reluctant to continue, but I did. There is no such thing. And goodness? I don't know what goodness means. What do you think it means? He asked. Reluctantly, I told him what I thought. That it was a necessary creation of our nature to believe that goodness and perfection lay in our future, and lay in our past, that goodness was a fantasy taught to our children to make the present tolerable, that few benefits had ever come from proclamations of goodness or selfless acts that in the end fell into the folds of humanity's historical continuum. At the end of our salvation, there will be but two ores for posterity, hope and sin. And because hope is predicated on the overcoming of sin, hope is, and was from its conception, a paradoxical entity. So what shall remain at the end of our time? Only sin, only vice. I finished my diatribe, and the priest frowned. Indeed, you have no faith. He seemed lost in thought, and as we stood in the dark church, a giant dome hovering over us, I could not help but feel an affinity for this man who took my words with such sincerity. Part of me wished I had not spoken so harshly of his vision, for at that moment I was uncertain if I believed it myself. After a moment he continued. What good have you done? I stood unsure of how to respond, unsure if I should declare myself a party bureaucrat and confess my part in condemning the names. But it was not a confession that he wanted, only to know what good I had done in this world. And it struck me that I could not think of anything, and so I said nothing. The priest remained silent, and we stood in the empty echo of flickering candles. Eventually he sat back in the pew. Why be a virtuous man? This is the question of our existence. Philosophers, theologians, prophets have given us answers, but in the end none truly satisfy. Through all the words and fanciful ideals, there is only one thing that remains. Choice. To act to speak out, to see, to hear. Choices are our own to make, for better or worse. Whether one acts or one sits back and lets the status quo continue. Choice has been made. It is you, then, who chooses to be good or not. You choose what is good or not. He rose, then and walked up to me, placing his hand on my shoulder. This is God's gift to you. Slowly he turned and hobbled back into the darkness. He seemed slower and older than before, as if our conversation had aged him. I remained standing under the dome until anxiety lifted my legs and against my will propelled me into a sprint and carried me from the church. As I waited for her to emerge from the bath, I stared out the window and smoked a cigarette. How strange that only this morning a breeze swept through this window and brushed my face, and now Anetska was in my apartment and I had beaten a man, perhaps even killed him. The thought amused me somehow. Not the specific event, but the day's progression. Had the host at the bistro not sat me where I had, I would not have viewed the amorous couple. Had I not viewed the amorous couple, I would not have felt the compulsion to see Anetska. And then certainly I would have not found myself alone in this apartment lingering over a bottle of brandy, bemoaning the name of Peter Ledek. Peter Ledek. The name had barely crossed my mind all day. Admonishments and condemnations had been kept at bay, replaced by the better, kinder, gentler Anetska. Had I believed in providence and fate, I would have certainly ascribed their work to this day. My thoughts were halted by Anetska exiting the bathroom, and I jumped to put out my cigarette. My bathrobe dangled over her small body, and she looked loose in it. I tried to smile empathetically at her, uncertain what to say that would make her more comfortable, more safe. Then she slipped the robe off and stood naked in my living room. I realized I had not yet thought of sleeping with her, yet here she offered herself as though in payment for my aid. A cool wind blew in front of the window and she shivered. There was a sad beauty that emanated from her, and I felt myself drawn to this sadness more than to any other part of her. I wanted to know why it was there, why she wore it. I turned and picked up the pajamas I had left for her on the table and handed them to her. You can sleep in the bed. The floor will be fine for me. I smiled, at myself more than Anetska. She took the pajamas and turned to slip into them, as though I were a gentleman. I turned my back to her and provided her with the illusion of privacy. I was acting a fool, I thought, immature to be sure. What would Anetska think of me when the sun rose the next morning? Childish or gallant? The sound of the bed creaking signaled that Anetska was pulling the covers above her. I moved and took a blanket from the trunk and sat against the bed, and then walked near my desk on the far side of the room and spread it out on the floor. With no words I could think to comfort her, I said goodnight and turned off the lamp. A few moments later, I heard Anetska whisper through the darkness, Closer. She cleared her throat as though to navigate through the tears, and then whispered again. Please, come closer. I walked over and laid the blanket out on the floor beside the bed. Then I laid down on the blanket, with each wooden floorboard claiming their individuality in my back. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw Netska's bruised hand dangling over the side of the bed. It was open as if to be held. I lifted my hand and slid my fingers through hers. Thank you, she whispered. The moon once again shows itself and I stand. My shoulder is still sore. I search for the pad which I lost on my whirl down the hill and soon find it. I turn around. Before me, row on row, are the graves laid out by the state. These are not the graves of the intended forgotten, but line upon line of men slaughtered in battle, those who gave their life for a country now occupied by others. For what did they give it? I wish I could say that as I stood among these graves, a wave of patriotic pride came over me. But all I feel is an incredible sadness. It is the sadness of waste, of spoiled lives, of lives deceived to fight for a cause that was created by men who sit at desks far away from danger. Now the ground beneath me is filled with the deceived dead, rotting in the cold earth. The men who sit in comfortable chairs call this sacrifice. But what do they know of sacrifice? They wave banners of freedom and liberty as they invade and oppress. They ignore the will of the people just as they proclaim that they are of its fulfillment. I began to write each name as though it is a vindication against the state which killed them. Not the Russian state or the Czechoslovak Republic or the Nazi state, but the state, that false thing that's set out by the powerful to entrench themselves against those they proclaim to serve. East or west, north or south, it does not matter. Old men will always send the young to die. Standing in this place, there is nothing but venom in my body for this institution that has caused misery for so many. Caused families to separate, to flee, to fight, to kill, and for what? Leaders cry freedom, liberty, democracy. They proclaim that they are the will of the people, and yet it is the will of the people that terrifies them above all. Make no mistake, it is in the West as it is here. Here our will is bent to the party, but in the West, will is bent to those that pay one's wage. I do not resist here to become like the West. I resist here because now, at this moment, goodness requires no less. Here I stand, and I profess that from this moment on I will not do the work of any master who bears the word of state, whether east or west, north or south. Those who suppress, those who do violence, those who kill and send the young to be killed, those who plot to destroy the will of the people, those who ignore it, those who leave men and women on the street to beg for their food, those who make secret arrests, those who listen to our conversations and make us to be afraid, those who steal food from our mouths and use it to fatten their bellies, those who call upon liberty and freedom when they mean oppression and submission, those who use their power to exploit the powerless. Here in this place, I kneel down before these men who lie 6 feet below me. There is nothing more moving or spiritual about it. It sickens me, and as I kneel, I swear to their spirits never will I take up the sword or the pen, the fist or the hammer in pursuit of the state. to help prop up the powerful. And I swear that I will be their vindication. In the solitude of my apartment, I carefully packaged the lists in the pages, inscribed with the hundreds of names, and slid it into a large envelope. Once they are all neatly tucked in, I sit at my typewriter and insert a new sheet. My fingers jump up and down as they write out my name, followed by date of birth, September 10th, 1934, 173, Popkopeskia Street, Prague. No children, no spouse, Justice Ministry official. Engaged in counter-revolutionary activities. And then, with remarkable ease, my warrant is complete. I pull the page from the typewriter and stare at it. Engaged in counter-revolutionary activities. I read this particular line and find myself quite inexplicably bursting into laughter. It is the laughter that only a prisoner can shout when they have read their pardon. It is the laughter of a man who has discovered that goodness still lies within him. It is the laughter that comes when guns are pointed at our heads, but truth lives in us. We laugh because the world is absurd, because we are flawed creations, because the saints look down upon us and judge. My laughter fills the apartment and rises over the city. For a moment it drifts up to the saints that live above the walking throngs. My laughter looks down upon the world and sees where men are as small as ants, where walls are as malleable as sand dunes formed by the wind, where communists, capitalists, fascists, and democrats are indistinguishable from one another. Here my laughter soars and grows to an echo that stretches from London to Berlin to Prague to Moscow to Washington. Here my laughter dances in the ears of the powerful. It sings to them the lullabies that their mothers sang to them as children, and reminds them that they are human and surrounded by a family of humanity. From my small flat, my laughter joins the chorus of countless men and women whose laughter is constant, whose laughter disarms the powerful and causes them to cry. From Washington to Moscow, the powerful will grasp their weapons and open their prisons to try and stop our laughter. But they cannot, because it fills the skies and echoes through eternity. It is the laughter of resistance, the laughter of freedom, the laughter of joy, the laughter of goodness. My stomach aches from laughter, but I read the line over and over again. Engaged in counter-revolutionary activities. If what I'm doing is counter-revolutionary, then living must be counter-revolutionary. And then the echoes of my laughter melt away and I stand alone in my apartment. I do not want to lose my life. I do not want to be arrested, nor do I want to live under the oppressive rules of others. I sit down on the floor in silence and read the line once again. Engaged in counter-revolutionary activities. What have I done that is so good that I can set my laughter among the saints? I am not a saint, and though my laughter for a moment ascended to them, it has fallen back down onto the city and into my trembling body, where it once again lies buried under anxiety and fear. I stand up and return to the typewriter. Taking a fresh sheet of paper, I slid it into the machine and began. To whom it may concern, We are the disappeared, the intentionally forgotten. Know that we laughed, and we laugh now. Perhaps we have disappeared, and perhaps no one will ever see this or read our names. But if you are reading this, know that you are not and have not lived. If you have not laughed at the absurdity of the world, laughed because you saw goodness and felt it, we have laughed and dreamt with the saints. We have dreamt of living. I take to the street, fold it, and begin to slide. The sheet from the typewriter into the envelope that contains the names of all that disappeared. But then I retrieve the note and open it once again. Write with a dulled pen. Peter Ledek and Zdenya Havilove. I slide the note into the package and seal the envelope. Outside the streets are dark. Only a few people are out, and I know I must hurry if I'm to avoid suspicion. I will not be surprised if in the darkness the secret police are lurking, watching me, curious to know what madness I now indulge. I pass through a number of dark alleys in a haste, trying to shake off any ghostly operatives. I hurry towards the British Embassy, the envelope pressed tightly against my chest. I walk briskly through the streets, sure never to break into a run, lest I draw attention to myself. My paranoia grows with each step as I near the embassy. The laughter seems to have all but disappeared from me, and anxiety eats away at my resolve. I turn the corner and see the Union Jack billowing in the wind. It does not comfort me, and I cannot imagine the package that now presses against my chest anywhere but with me. These names did not disappear because they wanted to leave their country. They disappeared because they wanted to stay, to realize their paradise in their home, and become saints in their own house. Our dreams are not of the West, or of Western capitalism. They are not of hope to replace one kind of state power with another, but to regain our own power and choose for ourselves. I think of the cemetery where lay the fallen soldiers of our land, and I think that the West has such cemeteries, acres of land where rest the rotting corpses of men killed by the state. Is it so different? The mighty will always send the rule to die. People do not give their past, present, and future so that they may have the right to consume abated, but rather to have the right to live. And soon I turn away from the Union Jack and walk away as briskly as I came. As the British Embassy disappears among the streets and buildings, I feel relief that I did not toss the names over the wall to be found by some Western bureaucrat and filed away as proof of our oppression and their liberty. Western nations will take our names and flaunt them as testaments of their superiority. They will wave them in front of those whose laughter they have stolen, and tell them to be grateful. I confess to Almighty God and to you, my brothers and sisters, that I have sinned through my own fault, in my thoughts and in my words, in what I have done and what I have failed to do. And I ask Blessed Mary, ever Virgin, all the angels and saints, and to you, my brothers and sisters, to pray for me to the Lord our God. I sit and say the words over and over again, not to grovel before God that I do not know exists, but as a declaration of history. It is an evocation of responsibility. Again I whisper them to the silence, and it is as though it is being marked on the walls, a record of my existence, imperfect and beautiful, flawed in its eternity. It is not to confess, but to remember, to let the fates that I have acted independently from them, that I was not compelled by a system of sin, nor was I compelled to do right. A choice was made and continues to be made. Here I am, spiritually stripped, declaring before God and the saints that I am and have been and will continue to be. I had spent so much time at my old home, in the field and in the church, that I had to run from St. Erin's to the station, and then was barely in time to catch my train. On the platform in Prague, my heart is heavy from the beauty I have seen and have now lost forever. The images of the day will haunt and comfort me, cause me torment, and hold my salvation. I look at the day, the time, and make my way to the lounge to meet Anetska for what is, in all likelihood, to be my last meal. I had asked her to meet me elsewhere, but she had asked why I couldn't come to the lounge. And I felt repugnance at the prospect. But I still found myself walking down the street in the direction of the lounge, rather than to my apartment, where the police may be waiting for me. I doubt that I will tell Anetska of my impending disappearance, detailing how I have orchestrated my own doom would only serve to confirm the very facts that I am trying to overlook, that I only have a few hours left of this life. And so I will sit with her. We will eat, we will talk, we will make love, and I will live in a fantasy of an existing tomorrow. Here on my last night on earth, I sit eating and drinking with Anetska, a woman who by any measure is a prostitute, someone I have paid to be with me, dozens, perhaps 100 times, and yet I cannot take my eyes off her. Her lips, her hair, her breasts, her eyes, they thrill my senses. She looks at me curiously and smiles. If I did not think it beautiful, I should feel embarrassed at our adolescent flirting and awkward conversation. There is an innocence to love that I did not know. One reverts to childhood and stands before their lover, with their hands open, a stupid expression on their face, glorious and pathetic, sad and happy. As I sit before Anetska, these emotions fill my head and make me dizzy. Regret for having been so foolish, irritation for loving her now at the end of things, awe that I have found such a woman, joy that she looks into my eyes, anger that she will leave this place and sleep with men because they give her money, and passion for her, for all of her, joins these feelings as they assemble in my mind. I look at her, listen to her breathing, An urge to take her in my arms and make love to her takes hold of me. But I remain as I am, mesmerizing and memorizing an image of her, to hide somewhere in the back of my mind where they will not find it. Yet in all this, there exists a lamenting that grows as our conversation is carried out by an exulting groaning and groping of men grabbing these women and laughing with odious affection. I think of Edith Piaf and their furious declaration of life without regret, and I wish that our surroundings would melt away and be replaced by the fantasy of Inesca's small flat, so that I may ask her if we can leave, if we can go back to her flat and have a drink and talk there. Straightforwardly, she looks at me and says she'd prefer to stay here, and her polite refusal strikes me through. For Anetska, it is work to sit here with me, perhaps easier work, fairer work than to sit with another, but work nonetheless. I ask her again to take me to her flat, and she tells me she cannot. I turn to look at a conceited man sitting near us, who holds a young girl in his lap, as if this moment were the pinnacle of her existence. I turn to Netska, and my eyes sink into her. In the midst of my adolescent fervor, I am customer, and she is product. What mournful indulgence of love have I brought upon myself? What of Anetska? What of this place? I am compelled to ask how she found herself here, and so I do. Why do you need to know? Please, you don't understand. I must know. I don't see why, she says indulgently. Please, let us step outside. I appeal, and she cannot deny my persistence. We walk down the hall where, behind closed doors, men are caught in fornication. Once I am gone, she will remain here, just as she did before, and I grieve that her life should be so unaffected by my presence, and by my departure, as though I have meant nothing. I think of my conceited proclamations in the church, and I feel ashamed. We step out the back door. It is cold outside, and a brisk wind blows down the alley, launching Anetska's hair into a dance. For a moment we stand in the wind, and I wish it would sweep us away from this place, but it does not. As I look at Aneska, I want to scream out that I adore her. I am different. You said yourself, I say,